2 weeks after the dinner with the DNA form, my father turned 60. My mother rented a private room at a restaurant outside Reading and invited nearly 50 relatives. She arranged flowers, hired a small jazz trio, ordered a cake shaped like an old vinyl record because Dad had collected records since college. She did everything. He thanked her by humiliating her in front of everyone. Halfway through dinner, Robert stood and tapped his spoon against a wine glass. The room slowly went quiet. I knew that look on his face. "Please don't," I whispered, though there was no chance he could hear me. He raised his glass. "I've spent 28 years trying to protect this family from an uncomfortable truth." Several people shifted in their chairs. My mother's smile disappeared. Dad looked directly at her. "Some people can live with a lie so long they start believing it themselves." My brother Ethan muttered, "Dad, seriously?" But Robert continued. He pointed toward me. "Look at Claire, then look at me. Look at Ethan. Look at everyone on my side of the family." A few relatives stared down at their plates. My chest tightened. "She isn't mine. And soon I'll finally have proof." Nobody spoke. Then he added something worse. "Maybe after that, Susan can finally tell us who her real father is." My mother looked like someone had slapped her. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying to protect him. I stood, not dramatically. I didn't shout, didn't throw a drink, didn't give him the scene he probably expected. I simply pushed my chair back, picked up my purse, and walked outside. The night air was colder than I expected. I stood beside my car trying to breathe normally when I heard heels behind me. Mom. Then another set of footsteps. My grandmother. She was 82 and usually moved slowly, but that night she crossed the parking lot almost at a run. "Claire!" Her voice sounded frightened. She grabbed my wrist. "Before you take that test, there's something you need to see." Mom stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Grandma looked toward the restaurant windows. "I should have said something years ago." She opened her purse and removed a folded envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside was a photocopy of an old hospital document. At the top was the name of the hospital where I'd been born, Willow Creek Medical Center. Below it was my mother's name, Susan Hale, date of delivery, time, room number. Then, farther down, a handwritten note beside the nursery transfer section. Infant returned from the nursery at 11:42 p.m. The initials beside it meant nothing to me. M.K. I looked at Grandma. "What is this?" She swallowed. "The night you were born, there was confusion in the nursery." Mom's face went pale. "What confusion?" Grandma ignored her for a moment and kept looking at me. "I was there when they brought you back. A young nurse was carrying you. She was shaking so badly I thought she was going to drop you."
My mother whispered, "Why have you never told me this?" "Because I didn't know what I had seen." Grandma's voice broke. "The nurse handed Claire to you. Then another nurse came in and whispered something to her. They argued in the hallway. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard one sentence." She looked at me. "Someone switched the bassinets." For several seconds, nobody moved. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain refused to accept the sentence. "You think I was switched at birth?" "I don't know what I think," Grandma said, "but I kept that paper because something about that night never felt right." My mother leaned against the side of my car. Her face had changed completely. For the first time in my life, my father's accusation didn't feel like the biggest problem in the room. I looked down at the old photocopy again. M.K. A nurse's initials. One handwritten time. One forgotten piece of paper my grandmother had kept hidden for almost 3 decades. And suddenly the DNA test in my purse didn't feel like a way to end an argument. It felt like the beginning of an investigation.
The next morning, I ordered a DNA kit from a completely different company than the one my father had chosen. I told myself it was because I wanted an independent result. That was partly true. The other reason was harder to admit. After Grandma's story, I no longer trusted anything connected to my father, including the lab he'd selected. I collected my own sample first. Getting his was more complicated. 3 days later, while my parents were at church, I went to their house under the excuse of picking up an old box of wedding decorations Mom had offered me. In the upstairs bathroom, I found Robert's electric razor beside the sink. I removed several hairs caught beneath the trimming head, sealed them in a sterile envelope, and stood there for almost a minute staring at what I'd done. I wasn't proud of it, but I didn't put them back. For Mom's comparison sample, I already had something better. 6 months earlier, she'd taken part in a family ancestry project with me and had given me a cheek swab. The unused backup tube was still sealed in my desk drawer. I sent all 3 samples to the lab myself. Me, Robert, Susan. I paid extra for expedited processing. Then I waited. For 11 days, nothing happened. I went to work, helped children pronounce difficult sounds, chose wedding invitations with Michael, answered my mother's texts, ignored my father's. At night, I kept thinking about Grandma's sentence. Someone switched the bassinets. The email arrived on a Thursday at 8:16 p.m. Michael was cooking pasta in my kitchen when my phone vibrated on the counter. Results ready. I opened the report. The first result was exactly what my father had spent my entire life expecting. Probability of biological paternity, 0%. I stared at the number. For one strange second, I felt relief. Robert had been right about one thing. I wasn't biologically his, and somehow that felt almost freeing. No more wondering, no more arguments, no more pretending his suspicion had no foundation at all. Then I scrolled down. Maternal relationship analysis. Susan Hale. Probability of biological maternity, 0%. I stopped breathing. Literally. Michael noticed before I said anything. Claire? I handed him the phone. He read it once, then again. This has to be wrong. That's what I thought. We sat at the kitchen table without touching the food. I kept looking at the report like the numbers might rearrange themselves if I waited long enough. They didn't. The woman who had raised me, who remembered my first fever, who taught me how to braid hair, who cried when I left for college, was not my biological mother. At 9:03 the next morning, I called the laboratory. The genetic counselor explained that mistakes were possible, but 2 unrelated results in the same report were unusual enough that she strongly recommended repeating the test through a second accredited lab. So I did. New samples, new company, new paperwork. 5 days later, the results came back. Same answer. 0% paternal match, 0% maternal match. 2 laboratories, 2 identical conclusions. That afternoon, I drove to Willow Creek Medical Center. The building had been renovated twice since I was born, but the maternity wing was still on the east side. I stood at the medical records counter holding both DNA reports and asked for my complete birth file. The clerk typed my name into her computer, then frowned. Records from that year are archived. How long does retrieval take? Usually 60 to 90 days. I can't wait 90 days.
She gave me the apologetic expression of someone who had said the same sentence 1,000 times. You can submit an urgent review request, but there's no guarantee. I filled out everything she gave me. Before leaving, I asked one more question. Do you have employee records from the maternity unit? She shook her head. Human resources might, but they won't release personnel files. I walked back to my car carrying nothing but forms. Then I remembered the initials on Grandma's photocopy. M.K. That night I searched old nursing directories, retirement notices, archived newsletters, anything connected to Willow Creek Medical Center. At 1:38 in the morning, I found a name. Mary Ann Keller, registered nurse, maternity unit, Willow Creek Medical Center. Retired 17 years earlier. There was an address listed in an alumni newsletter. She lived 40 miles away. I called the next morning. The moment I said my name and date of birth, the line went silent. Then Mary Ann whispered, "You shouldn't be calling me," and hung up. I called Mary Ann Keller again 2 days later. She answered on the 4th ring. I told you not to call. I know. Then why are you calling? Because I have 2 DNA tests saying the people who raised me aren't biologically related to me. Silence. And because my grandmother kept a nursery transfer sheet with your initials on it. The silence changed. It became heavier. When Mary Ann spoke again, her voice was lower. Where did you get that sheet? My grandmother kept it. Another pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. They told us all copies had been destroyed. I stood up from my desk. Who is they? The line went dead. That was the second time she hung up on me. On the 3rd attempt, I didn't call. I drove to her house. It was a small brick place outside Lebanon, Pennsylvania, with a white porch railing and a garden that looked too carefully maintained to belong to someone careless. I almost turned around twice. Then the front door opened before I could knock. Mary Ann stood there. She was in her 70s, thin, silver-haired, wearing a pale cardigan despite the warm afternoon. The second she saw my face, something in hers changed. Not surprise, recognition. She stared at my eyes for several seconds. Oh, God. You know who I am. Her hand went to her mouth. I know who you might be. She let me inside. We sat at a kitchen table with 2 cups of tea neither of us touched. For several minutes, Mary Ann said nothing. Finally, she stood, walked into the hallway, and returned carrying a faded cardboard box. Inside were old notebooks, staff schedules, photocopied policies, and one handwritten shift journal. She opened it to a page marked with a paperclip. The date was the night I was born. Her handwriting was small and neat. 11:15 p.m. Infants returned from bathing. 11:31 p.m. Identification discrepancy discovered. 11:36 p.m. Charge nurse notified. 11:50 p.m. Physician and administrator contacted. Then one line was underlined twice. 2 female infants released to incorrect mothers before discrepancy confirmed. My mouth went dry. There were 2 babies? Mary Ann nodded. You and another girl. What happened? She stared at the table. A trainee nurse removed both identification bands during bathing because she'd been told the bands were irritating the baby's skin. That sounds insane. It was against protocol. She nodded slowly. But protocols weren't followed as strictly then. Not like now. When she brought the babies back, she put them in the wrong bassinets. And nobody noticed? Not immediately. Her voice cracked. Both mothers had already taken the babies back into their rooms. Your mother, Susan, was holding you, skin to skin. She was crying because she'd had a difficult labor.
I thought about every story Mom had ever told me about that night. She thought I was hers. She had no reason not to. What about the other mother? Same situation. I felt sick. So what did the hospital do? Marianne looked directly at me. Nothing. I stared at her. What do you mean, nothing? They decided correcting the mistake would create too much trauma. I actually laughed. It came out sharp. So instead, they just left the wrong babies with the wrong families? The administrator said the mothers had already bonded. For less than 2 hours? I know. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. She reached back into the box and pulled out another document. A photocopy of an internal incident report. Most names were blacked out, but one sentence remained readable. Family notification not recommended. Administrative correction to records authorized. They changed the paperwork, I whispered. Marianne nodded. They changed the paperwork and told us to keep quiet. How? We were called into a conference room before sunrise. Her fingers tightened around the document. Every nurse on that floor signed a confidentiality agreement. We were told disclosure would expose the hospital to lawsuits, destroy 2 families, and possibly cost us our licenses. I looked at her. You've known for 28 years. Yes. And you never told anyone? I was 26, newly licensed, terrified. She wiped her eyes. I told myself for years that somebody higher up would eventually fix it. Nobody did. I asked the question I had been afraid to ask since walking through her door. Who was the other family? Marianne closed her eyes, then opened the shift journal again. She ran her finger down the page. Maternity patient, Patricia Bennett. My heart started pounding. And the baby? Marianne looked at me. Emily Bennett. She slid the journal across the table. You weren't the only child who went home with the wrong mother that night.
I found Emily Bennett that same night. It took less than 2 hours. A public records search led me to an elementary school website in York, Pennsylvania, where she worked as an occupational therapist. There was a staff photo. I clicked it. Then I stopped moving. Emily had dark brown hair, deep-set hazel eyes, and the same sharply defined chin my brother Ethan had inherited from our father. I enlarged the photo until the pixels blurred. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Not identical, but familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I had spent 28 years being told I didn't look like my family. Now I was looking at a stranger who did. I found her on social media. For 15 minutes, I stared at the message box without typing anything. There is no normal way to tell someone their entire childhood may have been built on a hospital mistake. Eventually, I wrote, "This is going to sound completely unbelievable, but I think you and I may have been switched at birth at Willow Creek Medical Center. We were born the same night. I have 2 DNA reports and documentation from a nurse who was there. Please don't answer until you're ready, but I think we need to talk." I read it 6 times. Then I pressed send. Emily called me the next morning at 7:24. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "How did you know?" "What?" "How did you know something was wrong?" Her voice was already breaking. My whole life, people joked that I looked nothing like my parents. I closed my eyes. She continued, "My mom has red hair, my dad was blonde, both pale. I'm the only brunette in every family picture." I told her everything. The DNA tests, Grandma's document, Marianne Teller, the shift journal, the hospital's decision. Emily didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was crying. "So who are my biological parents?" I hesitated. "Mine." There was a long silence. "Robert and Susan Hale?" "Yes." She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "And yours?" "Patricia Bennett and whoever Emily Bennett's legal father was." "My dad's name was Thomas Bennett. He died 6 years ago." That sentence hit harder than I expected. A biological father I had never met was already dead. A whole relationship had disappeared before I even knew it existed. Emily agreed to take a DNA test immediately. We used the same independent laboratory that had confirmed my second results. I paid for rush processing. The results came 3 days later. I opened them with Michael sitting beside me. Emily Bennett, 99.98% probability of maternity relationship with Susan Hale. 99.96% probability of paternity relationship with Robert Hale. There it was. She was their daughter. Biological. The daughter my father had spent 28 years insisting should exist somewhere. She did. She had simply grown up 35 miles away. I called Emily. Neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she whispered, "So, you're my parents' daughter?" By upbringing. And I'm yours biologically? Yes. This is insane. I know. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding. When are you telling them? I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. My engagement party was in 2 days. Nearly the same relatives who had watched my father humiliate my mother at his birthday would be there. He still thought I had only taken the paternity test. He had already told several people that the results would prove he'd been right all along. He didn't know about the second test. He didn't know about Marianne. He didn't know about the hospital records. And he definitely didn't know Emily existed. I think I said slowly, I'm going to tell everyone at once. Michael looked at me from across the table. He knew immediately what I meant. Claire, are you sure? No, I wasn't sure. But I kept remembering my mother sitting silently while Robert accused her in front of an entire room. For 28 years, he'd made his suspicion public. I decided the truth deserved the same audience. Michael was the only person in my family who knew what I was planning. Emily knew, obviously. So did Marianne. And one other person, an attorney named Natalie Brooks. I'd contacted her after Marianne showed me the incident report. Natalie specialized in medical negligence and had spent more than a decade handling cases involving altered records and institutional cover-ups. When I explained everything, she went silent for several seconds. If those documents are authentic, she finally said, the hospital has a serious problem. Can we sue? Possibly. The age of the case complicates things, but intentional concealment changes the statute of limitations argument. If they knowingly hid what happened, the clock may not have started until you discovered it. I looked down at Marianne's photocopies spread across the conference table. So this isn't over? No, Natalie said. But the legal case can wait. Your family can't. She was right. The 48 hours before my engagement party were some of the longest of my life. I barely slept. Every possible disaster played in my head. What if Emily changed her mind? What if Marianne refused to speak publicly? What if Mom learned everything from someone else before I could tell her myself? Twice, I nearly canceled the entire plan. We could tell them privately, I told Michael the night before. Just Mom, Dad, Ethan. No audience. Michael didn't push me either way. What do you want? I don't know. But I did know what I didn't want. I didn't want Robert controlling the story again. He had spent years making accusations in front of relatives, friends, anyone who would listen. And 3 weeks earlier, he'd humiliated Mom in a room full of people. If the accusation had been public, I decided, the correction would be public too. I called Emily the morning of the party. You can still back out. I know. You don't owe my family anything. She was quiet. Then she said, I've spent my whole life wondering why I looked like nobody in my house. If those people are really my biological parents, I'm done hiding from it. My throat tightened. So you're coming? Yes. When? When you tell me. The party was being held at Michael's parents' property outside Lancaster. String lights hung between the trees, tables covered the lawn. Nearly 50 people came, cousins, aunts, family friends, coworkers. My father arrived wearing a navy blazer and the expression of a man waiting to be congratulated. He hugged me, then whispered, Did you bring the results? I looked at him. Everything. He smiled. He thought that was good news. For him. Dinner went surprisingly normally. For almost an hour, I wondered whether I'd imagined the entire confrontation. Then Michael's father brought out a microphone for the speeches. Robert reached it first. Of course he did. Before we toast the happy couple, he announced, I think there's something this family deserves to hear. My stomach turned cold. Mom stared at him. Robert, don't. He ignored.
From his jacket, he pulled out a printed copy of the first DNA result. He'd gotten it from the lab account connected to the test he'd originally demanded. He held the page in the air. I told you all I wasn't imagining things. The yard became silent. 0% probability that I'm Claire's biological father. A few people looked toward me. Robert turned toward Susan. 28 years, that's how long I've been called paranoid. Mom's face drained of color. And now, he continued, everyone finally knows who was telling the truth. I stood. Michael looked at me from beside the projector we'd prepared near the patio. I gave him one small nod. Then I walked toward my father. He held out the microphone like he expected me to admit defeat. Instead, I took it. You're right about one thing, Robert. His smile widened. I looked directly at him. You aren't my biological father. The smile stayed. Then I continued. But Susan isn't my biological mother either. His expression froze. Someone near the back whispered, What? I turned toward Mom. She looked like she'd forgotten how to breathe. This was never about an affair, I said. Mom never lied to you. I looked toward the gate at the edge of the yard. Emily was waiting there. I raised my hand. Come in. She stepped through, and the moment my father saw her face, the paper slipped from his hand.
Emily stopped a few feet inside the yard. Nobody spoke. The resemblance was too obvious. Same dark hair as Ethan. Same heavy eyebrows. Same narrow nose. Even the way she held her shoulders looked strangely familiar. My brother was the first person to react. He stood so quickly his chair tipped backward. Oh my God. Emily looked at him. Ethan stared at her like he was seeing a version of himself from another life. I raised the microphone. This is Emily Bennett. She was born at Willow Creek Medical Center on the same night I was. Robert's face had gone completely blank. I continued. We were switched in the nursery. Someone gasped. Mom covered her mouth. The hospital discovered the mistake that same night. That caused a louder reaction. They knew? Yes. Michael dimmed the patio lights. The projector behind me came on. The first slide showed my 2 DNA reports. 0% relationship to Robert Hale. 0% relationship to Susan Hale. Then the next slide appeared. Emily's results. 99.96% probability of paternity with Robert Hale. 99.98% probability of maternity with Susan Hale. I looked at my father. Emily is your biological daughter. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. The daughter you've spent 28 years accusing Mom of hiding from you was real. I paused. She just wasn't me. Mom made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Then Emily stepped closer. I didn't know either, she said quietly. Nobody told my family. Robert finally looked at her. His lips moved but nothing came out. I had never seen my father speechless before. Then Marianne Keller stood from a chair near the back. Robert looked at her, confused. I handed her the microphone. My name is Marianne Keller, she said. I was a registered nurse in the maternity unit at Willow Creek the night Claire and Emily were born. The entire yard went still. She told them everything. The trainee, the bath rotation, the removed identification bands, the switched bassinet, the discovery less than an hour later, the hospital administrator, the meeting before dawn, the confidentiality agreements, the decision to alter internal records instead of notifying either family. I was told that correcting the mistake would traumatize the mothers, Marianne said. I was also told that if I discussed it outside the hospital, I could lose my job and possibly my nursing license. Her hands were shaking. I signed. She looked at Susan. And I have regretted it every year since. My mother was crying openly now. Robert still hadn't moved. Marianne pulled the copied incident report from her bag. The hospital knew. They chose silence. I watched my father's face change. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like fear. He turned toward Mom. Susan. She stepped away from him. No. One word. That was all. He looked back at Emily, then at me, then at the projected DNA results. His knees seemed to soften. For a second, I thought he was going to sit down. Instead, he collapsed. Michael's father, who had worked as a paramedic for more than 20 years, reached him first. Call emergency services. Several people rushed forward. I stood there holding the microphone while my father lay on the grass. For one terrible second, I thought he'd had a heart attack. He hadn't. The paramedics arrived quickly and checked him. His pulse was stable, blood pressure low, but improving. The conclusion was acute vasovagal syncope brought on by extreme emotional stress. In simpler terms, he had fainted from shock. They wanted to take him to the hospital for observation. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, he looked directly at me. Not angry, not accusing, just broken. For the first time in my life, Robert Hale had no argument left. And for the first time in 28 years, my mother didn't rush to defend. The weeks after the engagement party were stranger than the discovery itself. Once the immediate shock faded, reality divided into several different problems that all demanded attention at the same time. Emily had parents who loved her. So did I. Biology didn't erase 28 years of birthdays, scraped knees, school plays, arguments, Christmas mornings, and late-night phone calls. But biology had created relationships none of us knew how to name. Emily met Susan privately 3 days after the party. I wasn't there. Neither was Robert. A family therapist Natalie recommended arrange the meeting in a quiet office downtown because nobody thought a restaurant or someone's living room was a good place for something that complicated. Mom told me afterward that they spent the first 10 minutes just staring at each other. Then Emily pulled out a photograph from when she was 7. Susan started crying. She had Ethan's smile, Mom told me later. I saw it immediately. Emily still called Patricia Bennett Mom. She made that clear from the beginning. This doesn't replace anyone, she said. I'm not trading families. Nobody asked her to. At least, nobody who mattered. Patricia had taken the news harder than anyone expected. When Emily told her what had happened, Patricia initially refused to believe it. Then she saw the DNA report. According to Emily, she sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour without speaking. Finally, she said, "So somewhere, someone else got my daughter." That daughter was me. Meeting Patricia was one of the most surreal moments of my life. She was 61, with light blonde hair that had faded nearly white, and the same gray-blue eyes I saw every morning in the mirror. The moment she opened her front door, we both froze. I had spent my whole life believing I didn't resemble anyone. Now I was standing in front of a woman who looked like an older version of me. Patricia started crying first. Then I did. She hugged me carefully, almost asking permission with her arms. "I don't know what I'm allowed to feel," she whispered. "Neither do I." That became our rule. Nobody had to know what to feel immediately. Meanwhile, Natalie filed formal preservation notices against Willow Creek Medical Center. Once the hospital realized Marianne still possessed a handwritten shift journal and copies of the internal incident report, their attitude changed fast. The records department that had told me retrieval could take 90 days suddenly found my archived file in 9.
Parts of it had been altered, Natalie noticed first. Nursery identification numbers had been rewritten. 2 timestamps didn't match the original nursing log. 1 page referenced an administrative correction, without explaining what had been corrected. The most important document, however, came from Mary Ann.
Her old shift journal listed the name of the administrator who had ordered the cover-up, Dr. Malcolm Reeves. He had retired more than a decade earlier. Natalie tracked him down through his former medical association. At first, he denied remembering anything. Then she sent his attorney a copy of Mary Ann's notes. 3 days later, his story changed. He remembered an infant identification incident. A week later, through his lawyer, he admitted that hospital leadership had decided not to notify the families. That was enough. Both families filed a joint civil claim. Mine, Emily's, Patricia's, Susan's. Even Robert joined eventually. Not because I asked him to. Because, for the first time, he seemed to understand that the hospital's decision had stolen something from him, too. It didn't erase what he'd done to Mom. Nothing could. But his anger finally had the correct target. The hospital settled before the case reached trial. The exact amount was confidential. What mattered more to me was the written acknowledgement. Willow Creek admitted that 2 newborn girls had been incorrectly assigned to families and that administrators had intentionally withheld the information. 28 years late, but finally written down. Finally undeniable. Mary Ann was formally released from every confidentiality agreement connected to the incident. When I called to tell her, she was silent for a moment. Then she laughed, a small, exhausted laugh. Do you know what the first thing I'm going to do is? What? Say his name without whispering. She paused. Malcolm Reeves. Then she said it again, louder. For 28 years, she'd carried a hospital secret. Now it belonged to the truth instead.
The last part was my father. Robert didn't change overnight. People like him rarely do. For almost 2 weeks after the engagement party, he barely spoke to me. When he did, his sentences were short and strangely careful, as though every word had suddenly become dangerous. Then, one Sunday afternoon, he asked Mom to sit with him in the kitchen. I wasn't there. She never told me everything that was said, only pieces. He apologized for accusing her, for the birthday speech, for the DNA form, for making her defend herself over and over for something she had never done. But according to Mom, the hardest sentence for him wasn't, "I'm sorry." It was, "I wasted 28 years being certain." That sounded more like my father than any dramatic apology ever could. Mom didn't forgive him immediately. I'm not sure she ever forgave all of it. They stayed together, but differently. She stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own behavior, and Robert stopped making jokes about blood, resemblance, or who belonged in which family. He never again called me anything except his daughter. Not the girl we raised, not Susan's daughter, his daughter. Biology had proven him technically right and morally wrong at exactly the same time. Emily and I didn't suddenly become sisters in the effortless way movies like to show. We had 28 years of separate memories, different schools, different holidays, different parents, different grief. But we started building something. Coffee every few weeks became dinners. Dinners became holidays. She met Ethan again without 50 people watching, and within an hour they were arguing over music like they'd been siblings their entire lives. That made both of them laugh. Patricia and Susan eventually met too. They brought photo albums. For almost a minute, neither woman knew what to say. Then Patricia placed one album between them. I think we should see what we missed. They spent the next 3 hours looking at pictures of each other's daughters growing up. That may have been the saddest and most beautiful thing to come out of the whole disaster. Michael and I postponed the wedding by 5 months. I needed the time. When the day finally came, we still used the garden ceremony we'd planned. Mom finished the flowers herself. Ethan stood with Michael. Patricia sat near Susan. Emily sat beside her. And Robert walked me down the aisle. Halfway there, he stopped. For one awful second, I thought something was wrong. Then he looked at me. I should have believed your mother. It wasn't the apology I had spent years imagining. It was better, because it was true. I squeezed his arm. Yes, I said. You should have. Then we kept walking. There was no perfect ending. There couldn't be. A hospital decision made before sunrise had redirected 2 entire lives. Thomas Bennett died without ever knowing I existed. Susan lost the chance to raise her biological daughter. Patricia lost the chance to raise me. Emily and I lost 28 years of knowing each other. No settlement could return any of that. But silence had protected the lie. Truth finally ended it. My father once said nobody would believe 2 babies could be switched and the mistake hidden for nearly 3 decades. Now there are DNA reports, a nurse's handwritten journal, altered hospital records, a signed admission from the institution that buried what happened, and 2 women standing in family photographs that finally make sense. For most of my life, I thought winning the argument with my father would require screaming louder than he did. I was wrong. I never needed to scream. I just needed enough patience to uncover the truth, and the right moment to let it walk through the gate and introduce itself.
My father demanded a DNA test to prove I wasn't his daughter. For years, he'd treated my mother like a liar whenever the subject came up. Then the results arrived and proved something none of us were prepared for. I wasn't his, but I wasn't my mother's biological daughter either. The pen was already uncapped when my father placed it beside the form at dinner. 5 weeks, he said, pushing the paper toward me. Prove I've been wrong, Claire, or don't expect me at the wedding. My mother's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Her fingers were trembling. I'd seen this scene before. Christmas dinners, my college graduation, my brother's housewarming, once during my aunt's anniversary party. My father always came back to the same evidence. My pale blonde hair, gray blue eyes, and a face he insisted looked nothing like anyone in the Hale family. Everyone else had dark hair and brown eyes. I picked up the consent form. A private genetics lab in Harrisburg, paternity panel, 48-hour processing. My father's signature was already on the witness line, dated that morning. He had visited a notary before work just to make sure his accusation came with paperwork. I didn't argue. I'd learned that arguing with Robert Hale was like arguing with a thunderstorm, loud, absolute, and uninterested in what you said back. So I folded the form, slipped it into my bag, and said, "Thanks for making this easy, Robert." He smiled because he thought I meant the test. I didn't. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to know who I was before everything changed. My name was Claire Hale. I was 28, a speech therapist at an elementary school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In less than 3 months, I was supposed to marry Michael Carter, an electrical engineer I'd been with for 4 years. We planned a small ceremony outside Lidditz. My older brother, Ethan, was 32, broad-shouldered and dark-haired with our father's square jaw. Nobody had ever questioned where Ethan came from. Then there was me, the blonde exception. My mother, Susan, was 57 and worked in patient scheduling at a medical center. She had stayed married to my father through decades of suspicion and humiliation. Once, late at night, she told me she believed that if she stayed patient long enough, eventually he would get tired of doubting her. 28 years is a long time to wait for someone to run out of suspicion. There had always been odd details around my birth. My grandmother became unusually quiet whenever I asked about the night I was born. My baby album had no photographs from the first 11 days of my life. Mom blamed complications after delivery. And when I was 19, Grandma started to tell me something over coffee. The nurse who brought you back that night looked terrified, like she'd seen... Then she stopped. She stared into her cup and changed the subject. At the time, I laughed it off. Years later, I would remember exactly how frightened she looked.